This is going to sound weird, but bear with me. When I was in high school, there was this kid who went around telling everyone he was a demon. I don't feel comfortable even writing his real name, and you'll soon understand why. I'll just call him Patrick, even though his name sounded more like something out of a Shakespeare play. Patrick was extremely socially awkward. He walked around with this hollow, empty stare that made even some teachers uneasy. He wore the same blank gray hoodie literally every single day. I'm not exaggerating here. I'm pretty certain he never washed the thing because he always smelled rank. He was on the short side, otherwise average looking, but you wouldn't know it. His hood was constantly up, and he never took off his sunglasses, not even indoors. The teachers eventually stopped asking him to remove them, because he just wouldn't listen anyway. Now comes the weird stuff. He didn't really have any friends, but he had this bizarre habit of adopting people. What I mean by that is, if Patrick liked you for whatever reason which he could decide at random, he'd walk up and say, "You're adopted," as though that meant you were part of his inner circle. Apparently, being adopted by him made you safe from him, at least according to his own strange logic. But he didn't like many people, so hardly anyone ever got adopted. I ended up being one of the few he chose. Looking back on it, I suspect it was because he had a bit of a crush on me. None of us believed his whole "I'm a demon" spiel, of course. We just figured he was troubled in some way, which was definitely true. Oh, and by the way, this was all taking place in Wayne, Pennsylvania, where I grew up. Another girl I used to be friends with, Gabby, was also adopted by him. Patrick's crush on her was even more obvious than the one I suspect he had on me. One day, my friends and I were chilling on the dugouts behind our high school, just hanging out, messing around, who knows what we were doing, exactly. It was me, Gabby, Laura, and Luke. Somehow the conversation wandered onto Patrick's crush on Gabby, and we all had a laugh about how awkward it was. You could tell Gabby was embarrassed, but in a lighthearted way. We had some silly nickname for Patrick we'd usually use instead of his actual name because his real name was so clunky. But that day, I remember Laura let slip Patrick's real name out loud. The third time she said it, I swear on my life, Patrick just materialized out of nowhere and jumped on top of the dugout. He had a baseball bat in his hand. It wasn't scary in the typical, "he's going to bash our heads in" kind of way, just deeply unsettling. We all stopped laughing, worried he'd overheard us trash-talking him. He didn't say a single word, he just stared down at us from the dugout roof. I gave him a little wave, trying to ease the tension, and he nodded back at me, as though acknowledging me as one of his own, before hopping down and disappearing. Once we were sure he was gone, we all burst into nervous laughter. The weirdness of it was almost comical, but beneath the giggles, I felt profoundly uneasy. A few weeks later, something happened that was way harder to laugh off. I was literally at Laura's house. We were upstairs in her bedroom, hanging out on a weekend. Her parents were home, and everything was normal. At some point, Patrick's name came up again between the two of us. I think we said his name 3 times. And not 10 minutes later, the front door slammed shut downstairs. Laura and I looked at each other, both thinking it might be one of our friends dropping in unannounced. Her parents were pretty chill and had a "the door's always open" vibe, so random visits happened often at her place. We went downstairs, only to see her mom already talking to someone in the foyer. As soon as we got close enough to see who it was, my stomach twisted into a knot. It was Patrick. He was just standing there, casually chatting with Laura's mom. When she asked him why he'd come by, his response sent chills through me. I was summoned. Laura's mom, not thinking much of it, made polite small talk, then asked him to leave, which he did without a fuss. See, she actually knew Patrick and took pity on him for being a lonely kid. But to us, that was the moment we realized something genuinely creepy was going on. As we trudged back upstairs, Laura and I were whispering to each other in horror, trying to figure out how he'd known to show up right then. That was the second time we'd witnessed him appear after his name was spoken 3 times. Ridiculous as it sounds, we had no other explanation. Patrick literally claimed to be a demon, so our imaginations ran wild. We told the rest of our friends about it the following Monday at school, and they all freaked out, vowing not to say his name thrice in one conversation again. For a few months, everything settled back into a normal rhythm. I even started to think maybe we'd overreacted, that this was just some twisted coincidence. But then, one afternoon at our friend Johnny's house, it all came crashing down again. We were hanging out on Johnny's back deck, me, Gabby, Laura, Luke, and Johnny killing time on a sunny weekend. Naturally, someone brought up Patrick. Despite all our warnings, Johnny refused to believe the say his name 3 times and he appears phenomenon. Even after each of us confirmed our individual experiences, he was still the stubborn skeptic of the group. Laughing, he said Patrick's real name 3 times in quick succession, in the same sentence, just to prove we were being paranoid. For a few seconds, nothing happened. Johnny smirked, basically calling us idiots for believing in something so outlandish. But then, only minutes later, Patrick vaulted over Johnny's backyard fence. Johnny was the first to spot him and immediately went silent. The rest of us followed his gaze, and sure enough, there was Patrick staring at us intently. He stood there for a few seconds like some menacing statue, then jumped back over the fence and vanished. Johnny started yelling at us, accusing us of setting the whole thing up to scare him. We tried to explain that this was exactly what we'd warned him about. None of us had texted or called Patrick. We'd specifically told Johnny not to say the name. We all just sat there in tense silence after that. A few minutes later, Johnny told us to go home, clearly shaken. The final encounter I had involving Patrick was, by far, the most terrifying. It was the only time I genuinely feared for my life. A few months after the Johnny's house incident, I was home alone at night. My parents were rarely both away, but it happened once in a blue moon. With the house to myself, I invited a boy over some guy I'd been sort of flirting with. He was your typical teenage troublemaker, nothing too special, but we were hanging out in my room, and it was drizzling outside. Eventually, the conversation drifted to weird people at school, and I mentioned Patrick. I must have looked visibly uncomfortable because he asked me why I was so tense. So I told him the short version of the story. He thought it was hilarious and told me he was going to call Patrick's name 3 times just to see me freak out. I begged him not to, but he obviously thought it was the perfect way to show off or get a laugh. The moment he finished screaming, "Patrick!" 3 times at the top of his lungs, a fierce gust of wind rattled the window, and I heard the rain intensify. About 10 seconds later, lightning cracked across the sky. I felt my heart racing in my chest. He tried to laugh it off, saying it was just an insane coincidence, but I was too shaken to be amused. I rushed to the window, and as I glanced down at the driveway, I saw a silhouette in the darkness, a figure, looking straight up at my bedroom. The shape was blurry from the rain, but I had no doubt it was Patrick. I slammed the blinds shut and sprinted downstairs to lock all the doors. Seconds later, I caught a glimpse of that same figure through the front window, standing motionless in the yard. I felt a full-blown panic attack rushing over me. In desperation, I started yelling, "But I'm adopted!" The phrase Patrick used when he selected people to be safe from him like some kind of protective talisman? Obviously, he couldn't hear me, but I was beyond rational thought at that point. The guy I was with scrambled downstairs, trying to calm me, but I was inconsolable. I risked a peek through the blinds again, and whoever that was, Patrick, or someone I'd convinced myself was Patrick, had vanished. The storm raged on outside, thunder rattling the walls, so I sure wasn't about to wander out there looking for him. The next morning, once my friend had left, I mustered up the courage to check the yard in daylight. What I found made my blood run cold. In the far corner of the yard lay Patrick's familiar gray hoodie. Wrapped up inside it were random items of mine I thought I'd misplaced over the last few weeks. That was all the evidence I needed. I was prepared to show my parents as soon as they got back, figuring they'd bring the police in on it. But, as it turned out, I never had to. Because the very next day at school, Patrick didn't show, and the day after that, he was absent too. In fact, no one saw him after that night. He simply vanished. No explanation, no transfer announcements, nothing. It was like he was wiped off the face of the earth. My parents still live in that same house, and I think about this sometimes, wondering if Patrick ever came back, maybe silently stalking around the neighborhood. I've heard from a few classmates that Patrick was caught lurking, eavesdropping on their private conversations, so maybe that explains how he'd pop up whenever people said his name. As I've grown older, I've come to suspect he was just a severely troubled kid with borderline stalking behaviors and a deep obsession with certain classmates. The demon thing could have been a coping strategy for attention or a delusion. Either way, it still creeps me out to think of him skulking around in the shadows waiting for someone to say his name. Around that same time, I heard another story from someone I knew, a friend of the family living in Denver. He and his buddy Mike had an experience one snowy Saturday evening that forever changed how he viewed strangers in need. They were on their way to a dinner party, decided to stop at a liquor store to pick up a few things so they wouldn't arrive empty-handed. The weather was getting bad, but they figured they could handle it. After grabbing some local craft beers and a bottle of whiskey, they got back in the car. Then Mike decided he needed to run back inside for a nicotine fix. The timing was unfortunate because the snow started coming down heavier. By the time they pulled back onto the main road, conditions were borderline treacherous. It should have been a 20 or 30-minute drive through familiar suburban neighborhoods, but the storm was making the roads slick and visibility poor. As they turned a corner, they saw a parked car in the middle of the street, hazards flashing, driver's side and passenger side doors wide open. My friend wanted to just drive around and carry on, but Mike insisted they stop, someone could be in trouble. My friend was typically wary of potential scams and told Mike they were running late anyway, but Mike's concern won out. They idled behind the mysterious vehicle, waiting to see if anyone popped out. Nothing happened. After a few tense minutes, Mike said he'd go take a look. He got out of the car, disappearing into the swirling snow. Waiting in the driver's seat, my friend felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. He thought he saw movement, something like a dark shape shifting near the trunk of that stalled car. He panicked and slammed on the horn, startling Mike so badly that Mike nearly dropped his flashlight. But Mike understood the signal, dashed back, and they peeled away. My friend told Mike he'd had a gut feeling that maybe it was a setup. Someone could have been hiding in the back seat or behind a snowbank, waiting to carjack them. Mike wasn't thrilled that they just abandoned whoever might have needed help, but my friend stood by his instinct. He'd lived through enough bizarre incidents to trust his survival instincts by this point. They made it to the dinner party in one piece, the mood eventually lightening as they mingled with friends. Hours later, as guests were getting ready to leave, someone switched on the local news to check the weather forecast. What came next froze everyone in their tracks. A segment about a carjacking that occurred less than 2 hours earlier, involving a staged, distressed vehicle in the middle of a suburban road. The occupant of a passing car had stopped to help, only to have 3 individuals stew hiding behind a snowbank, one in the trunk spring out with guns drawn. They stole the Good Samaritan's car on the spot. My friend and Mike exchanged looks of pure dread. That easily could have been them if they'd stayed too long or gotten too close. Ever since that night, my friend claims to have an even deeper distrust of strangers. He's the first to admit it may not be admirable, but he says after seeing firsthand how elaborate these traps can be, he'd rather be safe than sorry. He told me, "I wonder how many people I've refused to help who genuinely needed it, but what else can I do?" He's still haunted by the idea that one quick decision made the difference between being a victim and escaping unscathed. It's a chilling reminder that sometimes the scariest threats aren't shadowy figures from a horror story, they're flesh and blood humans who prey on kindness. That leads me to the final piece of this puzzle, an old family anecdote from over 30 years ago, back when I was just a kid of about 10. My extended family was enormous, and we'd all gather at my grandparents' massive beachfront property every summer. Cousins, aunts, uncles, dozens of us in one house. I actually looked forward to it. I was closer to some of my cousins than my school friends. Among my many relatives was Uncle Joseph, who was a licensed therapist and psychiatrist. He was friendly, charismatic, and I felt safe talking to him about my problems. One summer, I started having gruesome nightmares, vivid, graphic dreams about losing family members or ending up alone forever. I told Uncle Joseph because I was too embarrassed to tell my parents. He listened intently, scribbling notes, and then told me it sounded like I was harboring resentment toward my parents and unconscious bitterness that was manifesting as nightmares. I was shocked. I adored my parents, but he was the professional, so I tried doing what he said, being a bit more defiant with them, saying no more often to see if it relieved my nightmares. It didn't. In fact, the nightmares intensified. When I told him this, he said there was one final option, that my mind was too mature for my body, and I needed to set it free. I had no idea what he meant. He told me if I had one more nightmare, he'd explain. That same night, I woke up in pitch darkness without having a nightmare, but I was paralyzed by fear, too terrified to move or even breathe loudly. After about a minute, I heard whispering close to my ear. It was Uncle Joseph's voice. I screamed, and he bolted out of the room. I told my parents everything, and my dad stormed into Joseph's room, confronting him. Joseph denied it all, but my dad wrested away the satchel Joseph always carried and discovered a trove of sickening documents. Research on inducing nightmares, personal notes about experiments, and more. Joseph fled the house and was eventually arrested when police found incriminating evidence on his computer. Whatever setting my body free meant, I'm glad I never found out. Even now, decades later, I sometimes wonder how I didn't realize sooner that something was deeply wrong with Uncle Joseph. But that's the worst part. Sometimes we don't see evil until it's too late. And even when we do, it can slip away into the night, leaving behind only questions and nightmares.